Okay, welcome to part 2 of our Uncharted for Environment Art event. Thank you for joining us. If you missed part 1 on live stream, you can check that out on our live stream channel at livestream.com/Gnomon. So before the break, we got an amazing look at the pre-production work and saw how the team collaborated to define the Uncharted 4 style in the jungle space, the clock tower is so awesome. So in part 2 now, we'll have Anthony, Heather, and David talk us through the Madagascar and fancy ship production work. So over to you guys. Oh, round of applause. Sorry, I'm terrible.
Hi, my name is Anthony Vaccaro. I've been working at Naughty Dog for the past 6.5 years. I'm an environment artist. Through the rest of my slides, I worked with a texture and shader artist, Genesis. So all the work from shaders and textures on out were done mainly by him. And so I'm going to be talking about how we developed Madagascar. So Madagascar was our largest level that we've ever done. It was the first vehicular level we've also done in the Uncharted franchise. So it posed a ton of new design theory challenges, art and technical difficulties that we had to figure out for a drivable space. Large spaces that would hold up far away as well as up close to our normal Naughty Dog standard, all the while still maintaining a nice smooth frame rate. Genesis and I were originally tasked with developing the look of Madagascar, along with all these technical hurdles like what does the Jeep drive on, what is like mud going to look like, as well as how does it play with the gameplay. So these were all different things that we were look deving, trying to figure out. James Cooper was our designer, Ifan was our lighter, and Icky was headed up FX. The look for Madagascar were defined by a few iconic looks. We had large gray granite rocks, eroding red, orange terrain, muddy riverbeds, green fields of grass with colored flowers near the water's edge, tan fields of dead, sun-parched grass, blue skies with puffy clouds, the super iconic trees of Madagascar, and then bits of ruins peppered throughout for story purposes. Now, for such a large level, you never want to go it alone. So with Dave and Heather, they jumped onto Madagascar as well to help fill out other various sections of it. They brought their own unique artistic flavor, artistic choices to all those sections to help us out, all the while working with Genesis and I to keep a very consistent and cohesive look, as many of our sections went from one of my sections to one of theirs, to one of mine, to one of theirs. So every section had to flow really well. So it took a lot of collaboration, a lot of asset sharing, and just a lot of work with each other to figure out what would work best. And here's an example of one of the later stages where these large cliffs I had originally made kind of felt not really tied in well with the environment, but a lot of the large boulders that David had created really cemented them to the ground as if the boulders had broken away from the large cliffs, and it just ties in the environment better to the terrain and the play space you're working in. One of the big problems with environments is that design never stays the same, but this can be a good thing if you work with your designer. Here in our first combat space in Madagascar, it originally had been concepted out as a small little 2-story ruin of an old tower that had fallen down completely, and there were just a few little guys that you would kill. Well, I thought this was a little boring, and so I worked with my designer, and I was like, hey, could I block out a tower that was a little bit bigger, that once you finished the combat, you could maybe climb up, find a treasure. He really liked the idea. He said, sure, go for it. So I blocked it out, and then he really liked the idea, so he ran with it even further and created an even larger tower that you would traverse around and get all the way up to the tower, up to the top to find a really cool hidden treasure. Now, once the art was in, things changed once again, once the combat designer was like, you know what, it would be cool if there was combat on every floor of this tower. So that, of course, changed things. We had to add different mechanics and different platforms around the tower to compensate for this new combat, which made it really fun because you went from a small 2-story ruin to a large 7-story ruin with Jeep combat, as well as combat that went up vertically, and then eventually once you got to the top, another wave of enemies would come in, and then you would get to fight them going down the tower. So collaborating with your designers and other people throughout the entire production team on Uncharted can yield some fantastic results. Now, the test bed for Madagascar and the original look for it was the river section quite near the start of it. It was the first time we had ever done a really wide open linear space where you can just drive the Jeep around, explore, go off rock jumps. This is where we developed the look, defined what the Jeep could do, what it could climb up, if it could climb up these eroded earth walls, or if it was better to climb up bouldery rocks along muddy banks. We would just test all these ideas out, and this was the main area, and this is essentially the final result. And so how we got there. We started off here in the top left-hand corner with a designer block mesh. This is what my designer gave to me with the idea of it's going to be a large open space in Madagascar. So I took that initial block out and did a quick artistic pass on what I thought would be a cool Madagascar space with the trees, just some foliage and everything, just based on reference. We didn't have a concept at the time. Once concept came in, they did a great paint over of this space to be all right, these are kind of the looks we want to hit artistically and stylistically for Madagascar. These kind of grand over-the-top cliffs, these eroded earth, red-orange earth, just the terrain just flaking away, and then, rolling green hills that go down towards the water's edge. So with constant iteration after that initial concept, we eventually get to the final, which, of course, it's a little more involved than that, but that's the process of how we go through initial designer block mesh to just doing a test bed to make sure your ideas work with throwing art in there. Because when a designer gives you something, it's always plays really easily for the designer. But then once you start throwing art in there, things change drastically. So you want to just constantly iterate with your designer, test things, make sure they work, and they're fun. Now, once we had decided on where we were going, we needed lots of assets. And here's just a small sample of some of the assets that made up Madagascar. I'm a firm believer in creating a wide array of assets, as I feel that reduces any type of repetition and gives your space a more believable feeling to it. Instead of seeing the same rock over and over again, you will just have a large plethora to choose from to make each space feel unique and different. When creating assets, I always like to think about things from what their scale is, large, medium, and small details. So we have large cliff faces, medium-sized boulders, and then smaller pebbles. The same applies to essentially anything you create in any type of environment. This increases your variety, as well as instead of having a rock that you nicely sculpted out and fits really well for the player's view, but then you just scale it up, and then you're now this is my cliff face. This is definitely a common thing I've seen in a lot of students, as well as other game developers. It is definitely a quick way to do things, but it definitely hurts the believability of the same rock that is a player scale is also the giant cliff face. And I just feel that I found personally that when you're thinking of things with scale in mind, it just gives you a better result, and it grounds the world a little bit better. Now, one of the interesting things at Naughty Dog is that a lot of our rocks here, at least for Madagascar, were made by two people. I did the initial sculpt or polymesh of a rock to try and get the silhouettes, the shapes, the large forms that I felt we needed based on the concept and the direction we were going for. I then handed it to my texture artist, Genesis, who would then go in, do a refined sculpt that we have here, adding those nice little chips, those little medium and small details. And here are some of the shaders Genesis worked on. All these shaders were sculpted in ZBrush, textured in Photoshop or ZBrush. And one of the things with Madagascar is that being such a large level, having everything be a unique texture, a unique sculpt with unique diffuses, unique normals, was never going to fly for our memory budget. So Genesis took an approach of taking the sculpt's normal maps, using a low-res version of those, applying them to the model, and then using 2 or 3 tiling textures to blend between them. So we would have 2 or 3 rock shaders that you would blend between each other, say one that was nice and smooth and flat, and then one that had a lot of chips in there. And then you can add on top of that a sand or grass slope shader to add in more variety. This allowed us to get the normal map detail that we got from the sculpts, but unique tiling textures that would be used throughout every asset that we had and keep a cohesive look, as well as allowing us fast iteration, so we'd only have to change one shader, and then all of our rocks would change with that. For how we laid out these environments, we had this concept by Nick. It was of this foliage, and these are some of the key points that we tried to get across in how grouping would work in this kind of space. We have our primary, secondary, and tertiary shapes. We applied this not only to the foliage as seen here, but also to cliffs, buildings, and really any other type of placement. Having a large central object followed by smaller secondary medium-sized objects to help ground that large object to the ground with a nice plethora of detailed assets to feather out the details and really blend your assets into the ground and make everything feel as if it just grows and is organically together. Not only was this done for just like placement, but it was also on the shapes. So in our trees themselves, we had large sweeping shapes and then smaller and medium, more curved shapes, as you can see kind of like on this tree sketch right here. So we use this throughout the entire environment. And here's some quick examples. So this little rock cluster here, you can see that the large overall shape here is this rock boulder that's just kind of sitting in the sand. And to really tie it into the environment, we have plants, some tall grass, some shrubs, and then to smooth out that transition even further, we have these small rock pebbles, smaller little bits of grass, and then a little bit of bushes around that. The same can be done for an interior environment. The table is your large central focal point. The dead bodies, the groupings of plates and drinks on the table are your second read, your medium-sized objects. And then like the cups, the fallen over chairs are your smaller tertiary shapes. Now, big or small, this guideline still applies. And for Madagascar, I applied this same technique to the overall reads of a very large space. So here we go. We broke up the shapes with the large granite rocks. Our secondary details for a read very far away were the large boulders, your trees, your eroded earth. And then your tertiary details are your smaller pebbles, your grass bits, your bushes, your little bits of ruin. This helped because everything kind of, you want to think of an environment as how did everything happen? How did this boulder get here? Well, this boulder fell off this cliff, and these rocks are just chippings off of this boulder itself. So essentially you go large is your cliff, boulders are your medium, and then small are your little rocks. And so this helps your read from far away. And the same applies for when you're up close. And so then we were applying all these techniques to the biggest space of them all, which we dubbed the volcano ascent. We took all the looks of Madagascar and essentially had them in one open, free driving space. This was the first time we've ever had a space where, although it was wide open, there's a lot to do, it's essentially completely optional. There's optional combat spaces, optional treasures, optional story beats, and just optional moments for the player to explore. But, again, totally skippable. You could just beeline through the space, skip everything, which is every artist's dream. You just skip everything. So, to build this space, I took the Disneyland approach of separating spaces out into different zones, like different little hub areas. So when you enter the space, you first enter the desert plains and the oasis. They're the yellow space with a little bit of green kind of in the center to draw you to that area. We then have like the eroded earth and the rolling hills. The idea being that the higher up rolling green hills eventually eroded away, creating these eroded slopes that would flow into the desert. So we were trying to connect each space to each other, all the while having each space feel unique and different and something to explore. On the left-hand side, we had the more grassy hills that were still near the rolling hills in the middle. And then on the right, we had the more sandy, rocky cliffs that were down towards the plains. And then at the very top, where your goal was, we have the vertical cliffs and the ruins. So using these spaces, each zone felt unique and special, and encourage the player to explore them, all the while trying to allow for a smooth transition and allowing each space to feel like they are connected in one whole area. And so for this space, I created a time lapse of going from a designer block mesh all the way to the eventual gold master that we shipped with. And just play this right now. So as you can see, things changed a lot, and it takes a lot of iteration, a lot of collaboration with other people that are on your team that create assets that you work with, and just always trying to find that eventual awesome art direction. And so that kind of ends it for Madagascar. But as an environment artist, you're never working on the same one look, and you never want to pigeonhole yourself into just one look. Madagascar was a very lush kind of desert, but Genesis and I also worked on some other areas that are very different from that. So you need to broaden your horizons as much as possible and work on many different things. I'm just going to quickly show off some of those different areas. So the reef that we had in Madagascar, in Uncharted 4, was a completely optional little side extra. It originally had started as one of the first levels being look developed for Uncharted 4. This was during super early pre-production. It was actually also one of the first levels cut from the game, sadly. It was cut before pre-production was finished, before we started full-on production, when we were still trying to figure out exactly where Uncharted was going to go. We were still developing tech, trying to figure out different rendering techniques, how much detail was enough, how much was too much. And this was just kind of our test bed for ideas, trying to get in there, figure out what would work. But we liked it so much that we kept trying to push it to get back in. However, it was gone from the game for a good year or two, until around near the end, when eventually we were able to sneak a bit of it as a hidden option in the Chapter 14 level at sea for people who were wanting to be acting like pirates themselves and go and explore and find this awesome little hidden reef and pirate ship along with some treasures. We also worked alongside with Jeremy Huxley and Adam Littledale on the jungle level that they had developed. Now, this also posed a different set of challenges as you're working with a different team who had already set a standard, a look for a level, and you have to come in and create a level around that. And so you need to work off what their ideas are, but then also you want to add your own flavor into it. And our section was a river rapid section through the jungle. And then finally, the Madagascar City Chase level, which was shown at E3, had 7 different teams working on it. As we were all preparing to show this off for E3, so you had 7 different teams all look deving the level at the exact same time. So you had to have a lot of collaboration. You really need to practice your communication skills, how to work with other artists, and sharing assets, and any kind of pipeline that will allow you to just work better with them as you're all trying to figure out how to develop this one look that will span a 15-minute awesome E3 trailer. And so I guess that's it for me. If you want to find me online, you can find me on Vaccaro 3D for Twitter, or I'm on Polycount a lot as Autogon. Yeah, thanks very much.
I'm just going to shift down.
Avast, mateys. I be David Baldwin, and I'm here to tell you a tale of the best ship ever to sail the seven seas, the Fancy. I won't be doing my entire presentation talking like a pirate. Might be a bit much, but I just want to briefly go over how the ship went through several different stages of production to get to its final resting place, what you see here. So at the beginning, I was given a block mesh by design, and it followed a very different gameplay than what ended up actually being in the game. The original idea was for a flashback where you were actually played as Henry Avery during his battle against the Gunsway, which is where he got most of his fame and most of his treasure. So the gameplay space had to take place on a very large, flat, open area, so we could have lots of NPCs, lots of action. The idea was to actually have the entire ship be a playable game space, so you had to be able to climb on the rigging, climb up all over the place. It was going to be crazy. And to top it all off, it was going to be destructible. So that ended up meaning that I had to build it from the inside out. So first thing I did was look for something to start off of, and fortunately enough, they had already started the area that got blown away really early on in the game. So I was able to take some of the stuff they had and resurrect it, and pulled off a few pieces that I could use to start off as a good base, since they had worked so hard on it and I didn't want to go to waste. So I ended up attaching that to the block mesh itself, and just started fleshing it out from there, adding in some of the basics that any ship should have, like cannons and mass and that kind of stuff. And for this one in particular, I had to add in some more extra internal detail, so that way when the cannonballs did start flying, you'd actually be able to see the inner workings. And so about this time, it was about 3 months in, Heather joined me. So I had already a good start, and she started breathing life into the model that I made. And while she was doing that, she was working on the hull, and so while we can't work on the same file at the exact same time, the way we broke it down, she'd do the hull work, and then I started working on details for the rigging, as well as the sails. So for the rigging, I did just a ton of research on actual vessels at the time, and tried to get it as accurate as possible. And the reasoning I did this is that when we went on a little, trip down to see the HMS Surprise in San Diego, and the first thing when I walked on the deck, just looking around, was just the sheer number of ropes. It was just like, what? Where did these go? Why do you need all these ropes? Eventually I found out. I actually did all the research and found every single rope and put every single rope on the ship. And it ended up with the exact same kind of feeling where you're like, that's a lot of rope. And ended up also having to make a small tool that let me make rope a little faster. And also, I did a little bit of a cloth sim with the rope, trying to make sure that the sails looked appropriate. Did a lot of research with the sails themselves, made sure that I actually looked up how big looms were at the time. So when they actually made the sheets, they were accurate to the right scale. I thought it was just kind of a nice little touch for myself, if no one else noticed, which probably no one ever would, but that's okay. I also added in detail into the captain's quarters and to just the deck in general, making sure the cannons were there with the proper rigging for them. And after all of that, about 5 months of work between us, and we added the other teams from foreground and lighting, effects, and even sound jumped in, and we came up with this final version. Oops. Let's go back one more. There we go. So like all good things at Naughty Dog, it was cut. Let's see. F5. Does F5 start at the beginning? Yeah.
Refresher.
There we go. All right. So, along with the Fancy, I also was set up to build the Gunsway, which was going to be an epic, crazy ship. Unfortunately, this is actually as far as I actually got on it, so it didn't get terribly far. But again, it was going to be destructible, so I had the insides and all the great stuff that made a ship a ship. So, because it got cut, we ended up having to move it, or at least we were talk about moving it into a cave. So we had come up with some good concept for the where it would rest and what the final area would look like. So Heather and I set out to make just a kind of a really basic, rough, interpretation of it. Let's see. And we spent about 3 months on it, and what I literally just did was I just took the ship that I just made, dropped it in this level, and I started working first thing on the rigging, because that was what I just spent most of my time working on, and wanted to make sure that it came across still, even in the wrecked version. And so it was relatively easy for me. I think Heather had the tougher job of having to scrape the entire deck of all of its paint. So that was a bit tough.
A little bit of rework.
Yeah, a little rework. So at this point, though, we also weren't even sure that the level was going to make it into the game, even in this state. So we quickly were moved on to other levels. One of the first ones we tackled was Nathan Drake's day job, his salvage office, kind of like little trailer piece. So we had set up the original kind of baseline for it, and then we handed it off to outsourcing to add in the final little touches. We also helped out with Madagascar. So we did lots of little different areas of Madagascar, and like he said, we did the kind of like the leapfrog one level to the next, which worked out actually pretty good. Because design was also constantly changing things. So, my area would be done, I'd start working on it. His area would be done, he'd start working on it. Next area. So that's kind of how that went.
Create a new. Each asset would just eventually kind of spring onto the next one.
Yeah,
helped out a lot.
Yeah, and that's the thing, as we create assets, we could pull them into each other's levels. So that worked out. More Madagascar. Spent a lot of time in Madagascar. A lot of red dirt. I'm kind of tired of red dirt. And then, of course, the City Chase E3 demo that we did. I think every single art team that we had actually worked on. I don't think anyone really escaped. But our little area was actually just the area where you actually drive down on top of the roofs, and that posed a lot of different challenges from a technical standpoint. Getting a Jeep to drive on roofs. They're not designed to drive on roofs. And roofs are not designed to be driven on. So we had to make it the gameplay space so that way when Bruce was playing it on stage, he didn't accidentally go careening off into the areas that we hadn't quite modeled out yet. So we had to make sure that it was as smooth as possible while at the same time retaining the kind of feel that you would get, you expect to get as you're driving down rooftops. And that was a lot of challenge, a lot of back and forth between us and design, trying to figure out where that balance laid. And last, we got to work on the multiplayer level, the colony multiplayer level, and I got to make a whole new ship for that one. Granted, the ship was much simpler and didn't have to have all the ribbing and all the interior space done, so it went quite a bit faster.
A little more cartoony.
And it was also more cartoony, a little more exaggerated in its proportions. So about after a year of that, we ended up going back to the Fancy. It finally got back into the game. Woo! And because we were so close to the end, I think it was maybe within a month, we ended up trying to use as much of the stuff we'd already had as possible. And what you're seeing here is actually the original Fancy stripped down of all of its little doodads, and we're using it right as the block mesh itself. So we didn't even go for blocks. We went straight for the actual ship itself. So the biggest challenges in the biggest changes that were made to the ship were to gameplay. The original gameplay, of course, was supposed to be this epic battle on the deck, and so it now changed into more of a traversal area. So we ended up having to change a lot of that deck space to really match with what we were going for. We ended up cutting a lot of holes in different decks, trying to make the gameplay smooth. But the biggest area that we ended up having to change was the cargo hold. So this is the original cargo hold from the ship as I had first made it. So it's comprised of several different areas. It was really detailed out and not what we needed at all. This is what it ended up being like. So one giant place filled with treasure. So this is the block mesh we came up with based off of the original model, and I was adamant about trying to get this area to fit inside the ship appropriately, so you could literally take it and look at it from the side and be like, ah, it fits. No parts sticking out, even though we clearly could actually do that if we wanted to. I think for memory reasons, we ended up having to break it into separate levels regardless, so looking back on it, I probably could have fudged it a little more. But we ended up adding more details in and started getting that more Henry Avery, I like myself kind of vibe.
Over the top.
Just sure. Over the top, gold everywhere. Like, who puts gold on a ship? This guy. Some big challenges with this space that we ended up having to deal with is because it's the final battle that you will fight in the game. It had to be super clear in its read. And you fill a room with a bunch of treasure, and then you set it on fire. It doesn't exactly come across as clear reads very easily. So between Heather and I, we ended up with a lot of challenges on our plate, trying to make sure we got the shapes right, making sure things were just out of the way, just enough where it didn't interfere with the gameplay. You had your clear space that the player didn't have to worry about while they're learning these new sword moves. So it ended up being a very collaborative effort between all the different departments to try to get this to feel and play just right. And this area we were working on it, I think this is one of the areas we worked on to the very last minute. This kept changing up until the very end.
There wasn't even those grates that were there. It was just like open treasure, and it would introduce way too many animation issues with bumping into that stuff. So we're like, all right, grates.
Yeah, I think we tried nets at one point and realized that was going to be way too difficult for the foreground team to do within the very short period of time we had.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah. So on that same note, there was also a lot of stuff that we made for this area and this very short period of time that didn't make it into the game. A lot of pieces that were supposed to break and shatter as you walk through the ship. One of my favorites that we lost was actually one of the masts. The flag was supposed to break off, fall through the deck, and create this giant hole. We end up with just a hole. So, but one of the biggest pieces that we did end up with was the ship in its final configuration. So it'd be a fitting end to a ship that sailed the seven seas, was stranded in yon cave, and then had a brush with Nathan Drake. So I guess it's your turn now.
Yep.
All right. Go for it.
This is actually a pretty cool video. It's like 8 minutes long, but I'm not going to have you sit through this. But
yeah, I was looking for questions and answers
kind of
between
cool.
each person, but
It flies through all the rigging and get a pretty good close-up view of that stuff. But let's see, escape, right? Twice. All right, how's it going, guys? I'm Heather Cerlan. I'm a texture artist. I basically was brought on to help out this guy with the fancy early on. And was tasked with doing that first look dev where it was in the present day, flashback to Avery and the big battle with the gunsway. And since most of the model was there it was really easy for me to kind of hit the ground running with it. So the first thing that most artists do is collect as much reference as possible. And since some of the team had gone to go see the HMS Surprise in San Diego, they got some really awesome reference shots for a lot of these really cool material call-outs. And so you start working with your lead that will kind of help you pick what materials you should kind of focus on and start moving and using it as inspiration and kind of establishing the look from there. So obviously this was the first iteration. The process of getting through to a final look is fairly time-consuming, and oftentimes, it's quite messy, and it's at a point where it's like halfway done, and it's not really all that sexy looking because UVs are all over the place, and lighting and light maps are busted all the time, and it's kind of an interesting process. But eventually, through iteration, you do get to a certain point where you're happy with the look. So my direct role with working on the ship was creating textures, whether that be through sculpting in ZBrush or using Substance to procedurally create textures, taking those and putting those in materials, which is our editor is a proprietary engine that we use. We can set up all of our nice expensive features and then probably sadly gut them later when we have to optimize. But UV layouts and vert painting, the mesh for the texture blends. So yeah, turns out there's a lot of wood on pirate ships. So I was making tons of wood textures. And since I'm a texture artist, I'm kind of obligated to show some of those. So here's some trim textures that were used that later ended up turning into gold as we decided to kind of last minute shift the look. This is the outside hall that was painted, which later turned out to be moved from the yellow color to more teal, kind of bright, interesting teal color, because the ship graveyard area right before ours took and repurposed a lot of the ship stuff that we had established earlier on, and we were kind of like, all right, well, Henry's ship is starting to look like all these other ships, so what do we do to differentiate that and make it really stand out as Avery's ship? And so obviously we're like, let's make it gold and tons of filigree and all sorts of crazy stuff on it. So yeah, more wood, lots of wood. Oh, sails. I got to make some sails too. And so once we got the concept art after the new shift for the change in the look, it helps set the mood, and we kind of take that and extrapolate it and put it through the rest of the level. Let's see. And so this ended up being our second pass once we got it in the cave, and it got a little bit of lighting put in there, and then we were like, all right, I guess we'll kind of leave this where it is until we get more design direction. So we eventually moved on to Drake's office cutscene, as we saw with David's presentation. It's right after the salvage dive. Oh yeah, an interesting tidbit with this, on the shelf up there, we took Avery's ship and scaled it down and made it into a little small model that would be a fun little foreshadowing moment for anybody that picked up on that. A couple more textures, laminate floor tiles with the base color, normal AO and height. Interior wall paneling that you typically see inside of those mobile home type offices. And then once we did the initial pass on this, polish and further scene assembly was handed off, and we got moved on to other levels. So in between working on everything else, we had a little moment where we worked on some of the multiplayer with a couple of other teams that were put on at the end to help with optimization and really trying to get it out the door. This was a really interesting team effort as far as optimizing. There was a huge push to start consolidating materials and meshes and trying to get it to run within the 60 frames a second. So that was kind of a hectic push there at the end there. And then we moved on to Madagascar with Anthony and Genesis. We would get one look that we would work on and try to push while they were simultaneously doing their look and then pulling in assets and trying to make sure everything was consistent. So these are just a couple of areas that David and I worked on together. Since it was such a huge level, it was quite the process, to say the least. Yeah. I'll just finish out.
Actually, I think the biggest level we had was in Uncharted 2, the train level, but most of it wasn't playable. I think this was the biggest playable level we've ever done.
Yeah, definitely was. So it posed a whole bunch of challenges.
Yeah.
Whereas the train was a very linear level, so you could easily drop out sections once you went past them. Whereas this, you could basically just keep driving around a bunch of circles if you wanted.
You really
like everything had to be loaded.
You couldn't drop it out. Yeah, we had to.
You could see almost everything from the end. You could actually look back and almost see the entire rest of the level.
Yeah,
like
I think
all
actually
of our levels
from
combined.
That point that video backed out, you could see the almost all the way down through to the start of the trails, and Andrew actually put together a really awesome proxy tool that would crunch down you could take your entire section of your chunk of level and crunch it down into a really low-res model that had all baked in one texture. So that's how we really were able to get away with these expansive wides. This was one of the early looks that we did for the intro, for the opening shot. We threw rocks in everywhere, and eventually design was like, look, this is supposed to be the kind of tutorial stage of how you drive this car, and you're just thrown around. So we had to kind of go back to the drawing board and simplify it a lot, and obviously the look has changed quite a bit. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So obviously working together to make sure everything's consistent is a really big key in that. So like every other artist at Naughty Dog, we ended up on the city chase level. This scene was pretty cool, being able to smash through everything. It's pretty sweet. And this was a early on progress screenshot. Like I said, messy, not sexy, but it's part of the process and iterating and getting there. This is a fun little texture that I did an exercise with. I took the Jeep, stripped out all the geo and deleted the rig, and then ran a simulation on it, physics simulation, so it dropped and just shattered, smashed into a bunch of pieces, and kind of picked out the bigger pieces that didn't really look that great, and then brought small chunks of that into ZBrush and created this scrap metal texture for the junkyard that you go careening over and smashing into all those cars. So that was kind of a fun little experimented process there. And again, this was another big, the entire demo actually was a big optimization effort for everyone, trying to get it to run in frame rate. And it's kind of cool to see, because there's so much sharing of assets, if if other team was optimizing their shaders and their textures, you would see the benefit in your area as well. So everybody had to work together to kind of make sure that we were compounding those savings. And so after finishing up Madagascar, I moved on to the cave descent area and worked with Henry Chang on that whole lead up before you see the Avery reveal. there were many challenges with this because the way the layout was, the cave kind of spiraled down on itself, and we had to figure out how we could cut holes in the ceiling to be able to let light in. But how do you do that when there's literally the other half of the level up on top of you? So this caused a lot of major lighting headaches, and there were a lot of light map errors that we were trying to figure out, and I had to work with the lighter that was on this level, Matt Morgan. So eventually, as we do, figured out and debugged and, did all sorts of neat little tricks to get through this. And then the last couple of weeks before, final pencils down, we moved back onto the fancy, and I needed to fill this whole thing with gold. So I took every little asset, every little thing, every trinket that I could possibly find that already existed in the game, and bejeweled the crap out of it or made it gold. And I was just like, I don't have time to make new stuff, so gold, 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 gold. But it worked. And then this last sequence with the big sword fight with Rafe involved, it was like every single department getting together, doing meetings every other day, just trying to make sure we're all on the same foot and that there weren't any dependencies that were holding other departments up. I had to work very closely with effects to make sure that I knew exactly where they were going to be spawning fire, and it was a fire that progressed over time. So when I had to go in and paint all the burning embers, I had to know exactly where those were going to show up in previous shots, and then working with design to hook those shaders up, and Andrew as well, helping me get the tech set up for the progression of the designer sets it up in the render settings and scripts it so that there's like a texture threshold that kind of just ramps over time. And then working with foreground to make sure that all these coins that were going to be scattered across the floor, that they could kick and shuffle around, and just making sure that all this could run within frame rate as usual. And again, this exit scene here, we were swimming out, involved many departments, and again, working with effects on fire placement, foreground with, when I had to paint in the chard and the fire on the sails, making sure I wasn't going to mess up anything with their simulations, or making sure that those got handed off to them. Cannons flying off, all sorts of stuff going off. So it's a huge team effort. And I did not put one of those fancy slides at the end that says, this is where you can find my work. But if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's HMC Drummer Girl. And I don't think I have any stuff up on ArtStation because apparently I'm old and I don't know what that is. I don't know. But thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. Do we have any questions? Yeah?
Hey, guys. Now that the PS4 is out, what kind of limits do you guys have for poly count on models, and about do you guys use 4K textures yet?
What was the last part of that question?
Do you guys use 4K textures, or what's it the highest textures you guys use per shader?
I think most of our we create most of our textures at minimum 2048. Sometimes they can go. Characters work with much higher resolutions than we do, but I think everything gets compressed down to 1024, I believe, right? So it's depending on what the asset is, sometimes you don't even need that much. So yeah, we try to make the textures as big as possible, because if there ever is a time where we need to be able to uncompress them, the resolution's there. As far as poly counts, these guys are probably better.
So for poly counts, we pretty much don't have a set number for anything. It's do it till it breaks kind of methodology. all of us, we're all really good modelers, so we know what a good model should be, what a clean model should be. So we kind of use those as our basic guidelines. We model things out cleanly. We model it out, within reason. We don't put a lot of detail in areas where you're not going to see it. We concentrate on silhouette mostly. There's lots of areas where we put more of our polygons and others where we leave lots out, and that lets us add even more stuff until we end up with a frame rate issue, and then we say, okay, where can we pull? And then we start pulling things back. So.
For areas that are in like the player's face, that's where you want to throw all your poly budget. For things that are farther away, you can get away with just the silhouette detail. And then LODs are a new thing, or at least for Naughty Dog, and they are the only way we could get this game to run. So we had to have multiple LODs for essentially everything, and that allowed us to have higher detail up close, and then it could just fade out as you got farther away. But in reality, poly count doesn't really matter too much. You don't want to have like 100,000 for like a barrel, but you want to make sure that your assets don't look faceted and look like they belong on like the PS3 or PS2.
And actually, to add on to that, the LOD thing, this is actually the first game that had LODs that we made. Previous to this, we used like little hacks and tricks and things like that to get our LODs to function, and it was really hacky. So, and especially with Madagascar, we needed an LOD system, which is so massive.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question.
Hello. For the textures, I was wondering how much of a draw for processing displacement was, or is that a big deal, or is technology powerful enough where it's just another normal map or something?
We don't currently support the tech for like runtime displacement. Any of the stuff that we do that involves displacement is proprietary tools that we're using. It starts from the height map. They take it and plug it in, and it basically dumps out. Like if you have a simple mesh, it cuts in where all of the height map and what displacement would do in a more simple, kind of like easier process, much faster process. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we've been able to support at this point in time runtime displacement.
For Madagascar, we didn't have any essentially displacement at all. I know it looks great on shader balls on ArtStation, but in reality, I don't think almost any game does that much displacement. It's just a great way to make your art look better than it actually is. If we did like tessellate a mesh a little bit more to have really high detail, we would use that as the highest res model and then quickly LOD down. That turned out to be a far better solution. There are a lot of problems with displacement, especially if you're doing like adaptive tessellation. There's a lot of swimming where polygons are essentially disappearing as you're moving farther or closer away, and so you get this weird shimmering effect with the polygons moving, and it was never something we liked, and we just found using higher res models and just LODing down as a much more efficient way to do it. And we did that with like height maps. The way that tessellation is done is just we essentially had it done by hand. So the highest res model would have all that displacement on there, and then you LOD down instead of it being on the fly.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi. Big fan of the game, and I love Naughty Dog. There's a lot of screenshotting of all the really nice textures and environments. But anyways, so with all of these environments, there's individual pieces of like grass and flowers, and to a noob's perspective, like me, I thought like all of these textures look like they take like 10 years to make with all these individual pieces of grass and stuff. So, and I don't really know the process of making that. Like you kind of went into detail with textures and stuff, but can you elaborate on how long it takes to make these like grass meshes and stuff?
Sure. For a lot of the grass, in Uncharted 4, we actually had two artists specializing in essentially making most of the foliage. It was Johnny and Artem. They would for a lot of their process, they use this photo capture tool. I think you can find it online pretty easily. They essentially would model out like a high-res, like blade of grass or tree branch, lay all the leaves down, like super high-res, and then it essentially just takes like a photo, captures all the normal detail, and then just spits out every map that you possibly could need. So essentially they would have to just model every like blade of grass, assemble it into what would be cards that you could either just paint by hand or use a photo, but we found that to give us the most high-res detail. For Madagascar, like a lot of just like the normal green grass or the dead tan grass, those super generic, that was just a quick texture that Genesis made, flat polygons. Then I just cut it up, turned it into like, I made a small clump, a medium clump, and a large clump. Again, large shapes, medium shapes, small shapes. And then I arranged them into a much larger shape, like I think it was like a 3-meter circle. And then that was my large area of grass that I would use. And then I would have different variations on that, some with like some dead blades, some with just lots of living, some with like some color in there. And so those usually would take not too long to make different variations on them, since they're all using the same texture. And then I could easily fill out a large swath of area with this generic texture, with this generic grass, and then you pepper in like your extra little flowers, like we had purple flowers, yellow flowers, white flowers.
So a lot of things are basically multiplied?
I'm sorry?
So a lot of things are like multiplied? Like you make like a lot of grass
duplicated.
And then like
duplicated around.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, got it.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, just to add on to that, like we each had a different method of placement of grass. I mean, for him, he worked on the circle pieces and then worked that into the places. For me, I thought of it more of a growth pattern, where I'd start out with the largest piece of grasses, which would be around large at the base of rocks and the base of trees, and then I'd slowly start to fade out with smaller pieces of grass that he had set up, and just kind of gradually, just kind of like, okay, if wind blew some grass over there, that would grow over there, and just kind of hand-placed it that way throughout the entire level. And we hand-placed a lot of grass.
Tons of grass. At the time, we didn't have any tools for that, really, so
it was pretty much
a
just
struggle. We didn't have the nice Unreal, just like quickly painting down grass, so.
Although, to be fair, I think it's nicer because we do get intimate with each area of grass.
We did have a lot of control, but it took a lot of time.
Yeah.
So don't do that.
And when design changes your whole layout, and you're like, now my grass is all floating. Damn it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I had so many bugs that it's like, this grass is floating. I'm like,
yeah, you end up fixing a lot of those.
Okay, bringing the grass down.
I don't want this. You take it.
Yeah, sounds really time consuming.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's my question.
One of the most things that I've been curious about in the actually Uncharted franchise is sometimes at the end of the game, you're able to add these filters. You get these like bonus unlocks, and these filters can be like a thief's vision, where like the enemies are red or something and you're blue, or you've got grayscale or sepia tones or something. How does that work? If you just put all this time and energy into making these textures reflect a certain light or a certain way, with these different lighting effects, like how does that work in your game?
Well, I think primarily the start of that was from our dev kits, we were able to, look at the screen in different, variations. We could see like, okay, this area has more, lighter colors, this has darker colors, and we'd have it in a kind of a Technicolor, heat vision look of things. And we took that kind of look and just put it a little bit further and made it more user-friendly and had more fun filters, I guess, to be put onto it. So it stemmed from actual production, and then we were like, hey, this would be cool if, and
a lot of dev kits have the option, like even Unreal has the option to like kind of just see what flat shaded mode looks like, where it's just colors or just your normal maps. So our tech artist like Waylon just kind of went through, added a whole bunch of really awesome stylized things that were kind of like fun that we had playing around at the studio, and they were like, hey, let's make these the cool bonus options, because we had them in Uncharted 1 and 2, and they were missing from 3, and fans really wanted it, so we thought it'd be awesome to bring it back.
It definitely is. Please keep that in your games. It's really awesome.
Any more questions? This one. Go to this one first.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. I had a question about texture resolution and how it relates to the massive scale of some of your scenes and maybe what your approaches are. Like if you have a road, for example, your texture resolution is only like 2048 by 2048. How do you then expand that road so that it fits across the whole mesh and you still add variation on top of that? Do you use masks on top to blend maybe the height with the color, or how are you guys approaching variation so that you don't have so much tiled textures on immense landscape scenes?
That's a good question. So in Madagascar, as a good example, you have these gigantic rock faces, and you come up with, several different material, like texture types. So maybe you've got like 2 or 3 different rock types, and then maybe you want some moss or grass to grow on that, and then sand. The process is, taking those 3 different textures in a material, and then you have a threshold, like a blend texture that will interpolate between, and you go in and you paint directly where you want each of these material types to show up. The big challenge with these gigantic rocks, you have to have them look, from afar, you don't see a lot of repeating, shapes that are happening in the textures, but also close up, you need to get really fine, super fine detail. So you would scale out the medium to larger shapes pretty far. Like you're like almost to the point where the texture resolution almost doesn't hold up close up. And then you take a small detail normal that you tile, maybe like 5 to 10 times, depending on, the scale of the texture. And you'll scale that up, and that's how you get these really, really like fine, granular, texture detail to it. And then if you look at it from far away, it doesn't repeat as much, and you have those different blends kind of, distracting from that various tiling bits that you have.
So when you guys lay out your UVs, typically you keep the UV space within 0 to 1. You're not necessarily ever...
So we'll have a couple different UV sets. One will be for the tiling texture, and those will be scaled. You can either scale it, you can either do it in the material, or you can scale the UVs out. And for the second UV set, you'll usually have your 0 to 1, which is mainly for the sculpt. So if you have some larger shapes so you take that ZBrush sculpt and you bake it out and you get your 0 to 1, and that will help you get these really nice, large, readable shapes that help with the detail from afar. And that's so yeah, you have the 2 different ones for tiling and for the 0 to 1 for the rock sculpt.
Nearly everything had multiple UV sets. For the terrain, for example, you just have this massive UV, just super unwrapped to get the textile density you need. It's not 1-to-1. None of our terrain had like a 1-to-1 painting. So like the second UV set would be a different scaling of that UV set for blending in like different size rocks or different grass and everything. So there's like a ton of blending, takes the artist a ton of time, and so they hate it when like modelers would come in and then just like delete faces, or they're like, hey, we got to raise the ground, and you're like, crap, there goes my blending. But to help break up that tiling, as environment artists, we're also placing assets to try and mask those areas out. Where you see a lot of repetition, we try and like mask areas out with different assets and everything.
Yeah.
Just so you can just break it up as any ways you can.
Yeah, that area doesn't look good over there. More grass.
Put more grass over it.
Generally the solution.
Yeah.
Kind of adding to that, it was very eye-opening seeing the thought put into creating Madagascar, because Madagascar is obviously a real place, and by like replicating nature, you're essentially designing by putting thought into something that never had thought in the first place. Hearing about like Disney and like having the sections, the hubs. Are there any more like resources for this sort of social engineering kind of like design mentality? Like was this all like a lot of just intuition on your part, or was there resources
There's a lot of trial and error. I think Disneyland was probably just the biggest, easiest kind of like iconic thing. Any kind of essentially amusement park that breaks up something into different sections. For the original test bed that we did, it was all kind of like one look for Madagascar. It was just this kind of like river flowing through. We had these green slope sides of grass on the hills and everything. But once you got to the volcano ascent, we had this desert open plains, these just a ton of eroding earth, more grass hills, grass rocks, sandy rocks. So it was the area that was the largest space we ever had. So we needed to have each area really broken up so the player wouldn't get bored. Because when you're just driving through these levels, especially in the early days, it was super boring. It was just like, oh, I'm just driving.
Some more rocks.
And you're like, cool.
More
grass.
Dirt.
More rocks, more grass. So you're just trying to like break it up. I think it was like we did it like when driving in the Jeep, it was every like 30 seconds to a minute and a half. We wanted to have like a new look, essentially. We just kind of found that to be where people started to get a little bit bored of the look and wanted something new. And then with the different looks, we were able to introduce different like gameplay mechanics. Like David worked on a section that was very bouldery, so we brought those boulders into the very big open space just to try and change up the gameplay so you're not just driving a Jeep forward and everything. I don't know of any other social things, but Disneyland was just probably like the biggest inspiration for me to do that.
Oh, I see. All right, thank you.
Yeah, very much about pacing.
Yeah.
You just like if we introduced a bouldering section, to have the player then later encounter another bouldering section would just be kind of like, oh, I've already done this before. So it's just trying to add like new intrigue, like, oh, this feels different, or like it's kind of like a landmark, like this area is different from that other area that I was in, but it kind of helps direct the player, like, oh, I feel like I'm going the right direction.
Yeah, so. A lot of amusement parks are like inspiration for quite a bit of the like how we build things, just because they do such a good job of making you feel like you should be there, and you're there, and the rest of the world disappears. And they have a lot of the same problems in the sense that they've got thoroughfares, which they want pedestrians to go down, and then they've got the kind of the pieces that they can get up close to, and then there's the stuff beyond which the person's never going to get to. And they do a lot of that kind of with different tricks and stuff like that. So they make really good reference for the pacing and just the way things can be built out.
And one motto I kind of always thought about when designing like some of these spaces was just like, what's around that corner? Like when you're going through the space, you'll always get a view of the next area, the next look, and you just get like, sometimes you'll just get a hint of it, sometimes you'll get like more of a broad view of it, and you'll be like, ooh, what's over there? I see some ruins over there. Ooh, what's that? Oh, there's some cliffs. Can I get up there? And so it's just always that what's around the corner. It entices players to explore if they want to, and it's just drawing them in. It's kind of like the little carrot on the stick. Be like, come this way.
Cool. And one question here.
So my question is in relation to a bit of the effects work. So you mentioned that you had to paint some ashes or stuff like that. And I was kind of curious if, as texture artists, how much you guys help with animated textures, or maybe, I don't know, whether it's smoke or whether it's rivers or, I don't know, those kind of things to help the effects artists design their effects.
So we don't actually help with any of the physical effects like smoke and, when I said ashes or embers, I meant actually in the wood texture itself, like making it look like it's, it's glowing from the inside because it's been burning and it's so hot. And there's definitely, scrolling, animating textures that went into that to kind of help that feel like it has, like it's a living, breathing fire that's underneath the wood. We definitely support effects a lot. So if they have, waterfalls that are coming down over some rocks, we definitely have to support that in the texture, with water kind of streaming and animating along the edges of the waterfall to kind of make it feel like it's rooted in there. Same thing with like that swim out section when the ship's blowing up and you're trying to get out of the cave. It's really hard to see, but there's a section, if you can actually get a look inside the ship, I have scrolling textures of all these coins that are like sliding down, because I was like, oh, that'd be a cool little touch. But probably 99% of people don't actually catch it. So just stuff like that. Like I knew that we weren't going to be able to have the, the resources to have actual foreground coins moving, because, again, most people probably wouldn't see it, and we were already hurting for frame rate at that point. So if you can get away with as much as you can in the texture scrolling, or at least supporting effects so that maybe they don't have to use as many, put as many effects in there so that it can be cheaper, then that's definitely something you coordinate with your effects artist to see what you can do to support that.
Yeah, there were 2 occasions I remember for Madagascar that we did have some textures created by Genesis that were used by the FX team. So when Drake walks around, in the rarity that you ever get out of the Jeep and walk around on the mud, you'll see that Drake makes footprints in the mud. Same with the Jeep's tire tracks. And so he just made like a quick sculpt for the FX team to use as the displacement texture that they would use for when the Jeep is driving around or when Drake is stepping on mud and everything. So some super simple things, but generally they work kind of on their own, but then working with, obviously, the texture artists to make sure that their effects work well with the look of the textures that they're doing.
Thank you. And one last question here.
In regards to asset creation, it sounds like pretty much everything was handmade. At any point in the development, was the use of photogrammetry ever explored?
In the super early development of Uncharted 4, yes, we tried photogrammetry. This was when photogrammetry was super new and never got any good results out of it. It wasn't hitting the Uncharted look that we have, this kind of slightly exaggerated, a little more colorful, a little larger shapes than real life, and we weren't making a photorealistic game. So it just, at the time, it wasn't really working out, and there weren't as many good resources. There are now definitely a lot more, and I know DICE has done some amazing stuff with photogrammetry for Battlefront and everything, but it just wasn't working for the look that we were going for our game.
It's definitely good to use it for reference as this is kind of the bar we want to hit, but make it a little more with a hand-painted or painterly flair to it. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Even though maybe displaced photogrammetry rocks didn't actually make it in the game, it can be used as inspiration or reference.
Yeah, and same for the shapes. If you get a good shape on a rock, you can we would take that shape, that really realistic shape, and just exaggerate certain areas to make it fit into the world that we were making.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Let's have a round of applause.